if you're going to do a coordinated attack against Crimea, you would surgically take out the Kerch Road rail bridge, knowing how long it's going to take to recover it. You'd also have a whole series of amphibious attacks. You would take out some of the radar systems and the headquarters on Crimea itself, which the Ukrainians have done. And you would get the Black Sea Fleet away from the area so they couldn't interfere with your potential landing craft and amphibious assault on the island. Now, again, we've no way of knowing, but these are the ingredients that you would probably need. And even if it didn't happen, just the very threat of it could be enough for Russia to rebrigade its military resources to make sure that didn't fall under threat. So it'll be interesting, but bluntly, what Ukraine has to do is got to find a different way of fighting the war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, former fighter pilot, military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, James.
Let's begin with the big story of the past few days, the fact that Congress has finally approved this more than $60 billion of US military aid for Ukraine. How long will it take for the impact of that to be felt on the front line?
Yeah, good morning, James. I mean, one of the challenges, I think, of this $60 billion, it sounds like a big number. It is a big number. But what's been approved is effectively money. And although Ukraine desperately needs money, it far more desperately needs weapons. And converting that cash into weapons and then getting them into the hands of the front line, that's the challenge. I think we have to look back just a few months. This has been delayed and delayed and delayed. And what we've seen on the impact on the front line is Ukraine forces have been on the back foot. The Russians have been attacking Ukrainian cities. They've been attacking energy infrastructure across Ukraine. And Ukraine has regularly said that they just don't have the weapons, the missiles to shoot these missiles out of the sky. And on the front line, which is obviously where the key metrics of success are for this war, Russians again have been pushing forward using the Russian Air Force to attack Ukrainian ground forces, which in the past, the Ukrainians have been very effective at shooting them off and holding them clear with surface-to-air missiles. But again, they're running short of those. So we're seeing the Russians on the front foot across the front line. And, it wasn't just Avdiivka of late, but also it looks likely that Chasiv Yar, which is the next name we think we're going to see on the news. And it's all very difficult. Momentum is everything in this war. Russia now has it. And although this announcement is very welcome, the reality is it's still going to take time before we see that effect on the battlefield and then get Ukrainian managed to stem the tide, which is definitely flowing in the favour of Russia at the moment.
And obviously, Sean, we don't know the specifics of everything included in this package. We've got a fair idea. We know there'll be long-range ATACMS, which could be crucial. What specifically do you think Ukraine really needs in terms of weaponry at the moment?
Well, I think what's interesting is, first of all, the process that happens here. It sounds 60 billion. It isn't put in an envelope and sent to President Zelensky. What's first going to happen is that they're going to use that money to restock the US arsenal of weapons. So the US will go out, chat to its suppliers, start to restock those weapons stockpiles, and that, of course, will take time. But because the way that the US supports Ukraine is that it agrees an envelope of money, that's 60 billion, and then periodically it will check with Ukraine to find out what it needs and then for supply to a need, rather than just making a decision now and finding out in 6 months' time that events have overtaken and there are different things that are required. So part of the challenge, I suspect, will be what weapons that US puts back into its infantry. There's also how do you get the current stock forward quickly? And we understand that some of the weapons are already in Poland, awaiting for the trigger to the green light, because obviously, although it was approved by Congress, there's a couple of other signatures and stuff like that has to be done before it can finally be released. But that seems to be expected to pass pretty quickly. So it's then a question of getting the weapons forward. Now, the three categories of weapons that we think are most likely, one of which is defensive weapons, so things like the Patriot missile systems and air defense systems, they are going to be desperately needed now, and because they are what blunten the effectiveness of the Russian attack. The second category of weapons, I think, will be those for the front line. That's more likely to be the bulk of the weapons. The front line consumes vast quantities of artillery, literally thousands of rounds every single day, and bullets. It's not very sexy, but that's where the volume is required, and that's where the US will be able to help out. But that volume inevitably takes time to move around. It's literally hundreds of tons of weaponry, and some of that will have to be shipped. Shipping takes weeks rather than days. That's what we expect. It might take some time. And then the third element, exactly as you highlighted, it'll be things that Ukraine can hit the Russian deep battle. So it's longer range missiles, things like ATACMS, things like HIMARS, all the things that will help potentially turn the war back in Ukraine's favor. But like a lot of these things, it's all about priorities. And as a military guy, I'd say the damage that's been done over these last few months with Ukraine losing momentum, that will be one of the most difficult things for Ukraine to reverse. Once you've got your soldiers, your morale's up, you're on the front foot, it's very difficult to turn that round. And I think what we're going to be seeing now is the Ukrainians will be going, right, we know the weapons are on the way. We don't have to ration our weapons anymore. But my goodness, we've got to somehow stem the Russian tide and then work out what we do next. Because bluntly, I think it was, this time last year where we were expecting a much anticipated spring offensive. Loads of weapons have been provided, loads of ammunition being provided. Yet 6 months later, front lines hadn't really moved. And I suspect, therefore, it needs a bit of a rethink as to what Ukraine's strategy might be for later on this year.
Yeah, it's a really good point about, the imperative being just defensive operations for the time being. I mean, on that, we've seen in recent months Russia become increasingly effective at using glide bombs. Is that where long-range interceptor missiles are going to be crucial for Ukraine?
I suspect it'll be less on glide bombs. I mean, the glide bombs aren't that accurate, but they allowed Russian Air Force to step back from the front line a bit. Bear in mind that, Russia has been trying to target systems across Ukraine, but the further the Russian Air Force comes across Ukraine, the more vulnerable it is. It was only literally the other day that we saw one of their big bombers being shot down by a really old Soviet missile system. But the fact is that the front line is relatively close to Russia, and that means that the Russian Air Force can probably operate most of the time within Russian airspace, therefore relatively safe, and use these glide bombs that can fly quite some way to the target. The challenge, of course, is that they're not that accurate. They don't have a great deal of kinetic energy once they arrive because they literally have no power. They're just gliding. But, of course, when you use big weapons on the front line, it does have a devastating effect on the morale. And ultimately, when they hit their targets, obviously, it's deadly. I think where the surface-to-air missiles, which particularly anti-aircraft ones, will be most useful across the rest of the country. But I think as in terms of the flow, the ebb and flow, let's not forget, Russia is by far the biggest of the two parties fighting here. And if they get dragged into an attritional war, which is effectively you mass your forces on the battlefield, I mass mine, and we both have a go at each other, inevitably the bigger force wins. And that's why Ukraine has to avoid getting dragged into that attritional battle. Its huge benefit of what the West has provided is precision strike capability, striking the Russians where it hurts them most, where they least expect it. That's been the most effective addition. And that's what Ukraine will be desperately hoping this new aid package gets back onto the front line.
Yeah, and Ukraine has had success already, even in recent months, even despite the difficulties they've been having in terms of, fresh supplies, at targeting particularly Russian infrastructure behind the Russian lines. And you expect, Sean, that to continue with this fresh weaponry?
I do, but I think we've got to be careful here, James, not to... We make a lot in the media about Ukraine using drone strikes against Russian oil infrastructure particularly, and we can get on to why they're doing that. But it isn't desperately popular in the West, because if you target Russia's oil infrastructure, at one stage, I think over 10% of Russian oil exports were being targeted. That has one effect. It drives up world oil prices, and that has an effect on all of us back at home. Now, I know that sounds a tiny impact compared to the dreadful war conditions of Ukraine, but inevitably that's an unpopular move. But bluntly, the only metric of success that counts in this war is territory. And so lots of the Ukraine, they've been very effective at targeting Russian fast jet aircraft, bomber aircraft, oil facilities using drones and the like. But they're still losing ground. on the front line. And if Putin's special military operation appears to be, initially at least, about securing Crimea, a land bridge from Crimea up to the Donbass, and then the whole of the Donbass. And if you look at the maps now, that seems to be where Russian priorities lie, and that's why they're pushing further west from Avdiivka and Bakhmut. And that seems to be why they're throwing so many soldiers at that, even though over the winter and early spring, it was a very difficult time to fight, and Russia was suffering huge casualties. But they clearly don't care. They were capitalizing on this window of opportunity when Ukraine was short of weapons, and therefore Russia had the battlefield advantage.
Just on air defences, Sean, obviously the US and Germany have been providing Patriot units. The UK's been providing Starstreak. What is the difference between those two?
Well, I'd have to do my homework to be able to stuff that up, because I don't want to embarrass myself in front of the many experts that will watch this. I think one of the difficulties is that when we talk about capabilities is that you talk about Patriot. Patriot's been around for a long time now. And what we see is a missile. We see a whoosh, a bang, and it goes streaking off. Actual capability of Patriot has developed enormously over the decades that it's been in service, because it's at its heart, it's a rocket pack with an explosive system and a guidance system. But it is so much more than that, because how do you take down modern aircraft? Let's take that as an example, because Patriot is a classic anti-aircraft missile. Conventionally, it used to be a missile like Patriot would have its own radar. It would light up the enemy aircraft, fly to it, and explode next to it. So in the Cold War, what we used to do with electronic warfare is that we would, if we were in the aircraft, we would have a clever set of electronics that would allow us to recognize when we were being looked at by a radar, and that electronics would put a false shadow of my aircraft to one side of me, and therefore seduce the enemy radar into believing I wasn't where I was, but actually somewhere else. And gradually it would move that shadow away from me. So then the missile system heads for the shadow and explodes well away from my aircraft. So then you have to update the software of the missile system to say, aha, how do I avoid that technique being used against this missile? And that counter measures is what's been a huge advancement. We go back to the Second World War, things like chaff were just little bits of foil thrown out of the back. It seduced enemy radars. But of course, chaff doesn't move. In effect, as soon as it's released from a 500-mile-an-hour jet, it stops in the air. So actually, it's relatively easy for software to identify when that's not moved. My point being is that we call it Patriot, but actually the latest generation of Patriot is so much better. And the ones that are being released to Ukraine will not be the very state of the art, because the US will not want the very latest technology to find its way into the hands of the Russians or worse still, the Chinese. So all of these missiles, it's one thing calling them Starstreak or a Patriot system, but actually the actual capability will be very, very sensitive and almost certainly secret. But they are very, very capable Western pieces of technology.
And on these longer range ATACMS, you sometimes hear this term game changer. Could they be a game changer? The F-16s are meant to be a game changer. Of course, we're still waiting to see them actually used on the front line. The ATACMS, could they be a game changer for Ukraine?
The trouble is, I'm a former military guy, James, and I don't like the term game changer unless it's credible. For all sorts of political reasons, the politicians want to make a big thing of it, because you'll remember that at the start of the war, the West was very reluctant to get involved, and we eventually provided anti-tank weapons, which were considered defensive, and therefore, how could they be provocative? Then there was a talk about providing tanks. President Putin wailed, said dragging the West into a war, but eventually we did that, and that's been undoubtedly given the Ukrainians an advantage. Then we talked about providing long-range weapons. We provided Storm Shadow, and then things like that. It's taken the Americans a little bit longer to have confidence that the Ukrainians will not use these weapons against Russia itself, because that was one of the problems, is that you can fire artillery shells across the border into Russia, that's fine. But if you use Western high-tech weapons to hit targets a couple of hundred miles inside, that was seen as potentially being an escalation. So I have no doubt these weapons, they are going to be an extra string to the bow. What would be a game changer, James, though, if we get onto the nub of this, is actually Ukraine is suffering because this feast and famine of weapons supplies. It's gone a few months having not had the weapons. Suddenly there's a huge slug of weapons coming back in. That is no way to fight a war. Ultimately, the rate at which wars consume weapons is vast. And you need to create weapons on an industrial scale. You know, in the World War II, stop building cars, build Spitfires. And that is how the West has a huge capacity to develop its defense industrial base, but it's not really doing that. Whereas Putin has expanded his defense industrial base by 3 times the size it was since the start of the war. He's got oil revenue piling in where he's using to be able to buy massive quantities of shells from North Korea, missiles from Iran, and that is creating a sustainable model for the Russian war campaign. Where is the sustainable model for the West? The West has the capacity to do it. It just hasn't yet done it. And there are lots of things like putting boots on the ground. If the West was to do that and or set up a no-fly zone, however provocative that might be, that would stop Russia in its tracks. So there is no issue here that the West has the ability to stop Russia. It's more a question of whether it has the political intent. And part of that we're seeing in this feast and famine of weapons supplies.
Do you sense that changing, Sean? Do you sense that in the US and certainly in Europe, an awareness that we need to increase our defence industrial base is beginning to shift?
Unfortunately, there's a double-edged sword there, James. I think we're seeing in the media a great deal of rhetoric about World War III and the army saying it's not big enough, and some of Europe feeling very vulnerable because this is on their doorstep. Part of the challenge, I think, is that NATO membership is a central pillar of our defence strategy in this country, but only 11 of the 32 countries actually pay the 2% they should be paying. And therefore, Trump's point has always been, however badly made it was, that everybody should be paying their way. It shouldn't be any countries being subsidised. So I do think a lot of countries are now waking up. Poland's now spending 3.5% of its GDP on defence, a massive hike. The challenge, though, is where do you spend that money? Do you, A, use the extra money to pile aid into Ukraine? Or do you go, no, actually, we feel vulnerable ourselves and protection of your own nation is the number one priority. So the danger of all of this Armageddon, World War III rhetoric is that nations will find more money, but might spend more money on their national capability rather than supporting Ukraine. And I think the worrying trend as well, obviously, like the US, is that the US has done an amazing job around the world. It provides by far the lion's share of the military aid. But inevitably, like this country, they have their own domestic priorities. And inevitably, what we've seen is a shift from saying, why are we supporting this war a long way away with huge amounts of money when we have our own domestic priorities at home? And you can see in the political rhetoric, and particularly polls, there's a lot of Americans who say they should be stopping the support for Ukraine. And I think that's going to be a more enduring problem the longer this war goes on.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And there is a fear that, although obviously this new aid package is very welcome, might it be the last aid package, certainly of this size, that the US gives to Ukraine, and we will have to wait and see. Worth saying, Sean, also the UK has announced a new package of military equipment this week, albeit far smaller, understandably, including, and I thought this was interesting, sending 60 boats to Ukraine, including offshore raiding crafts and dive boats. Now, how do you see those being used, Sean? Is that to help Ukraine with its attempts to establish bridgeheads over the Dnipro?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, I should say that I occasionally get criticised for helping Russia. Well, if some old grey-haired warthog of a battlefield can help when I have no intelligence directly from any of the militaries involved, then Ukraine's in a pretty bad way. I think from a detached perspective, I look at it from a military strategy. Last year, Ukraine was confident it was going to be able to push Russia back with a load of weapons and a lot of moral, physical support. Ukraine didn't manage to shift the battlefield at all. So what seems strange is that if they tried to do the same again, it's almost certain they'd have the same outcome. So if you now, James, were the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, what would you do differently? It's a rhetorical question. But one of the things, they call it centers of gravity in military parlance. What is the one thing that Russia would not want to lose in this battle? And almost certainly that's Crimea. The port of Sevastopol, it's the only warm water port that Russia has. It's been hugely strategically important for Russia for hundreds of years. Hundreds of thousands of people died to secure it. That would not be something that Russia would want to lose. Now, Ukraine has very effectively targeted the Kerch rail bridge that links Crimea to the Russian mainland. The only other way in, obviously, is via the land bridge. And if Ukraine has been very effective at targeting the Black Sea Fleet, which effectively has pushed that all the way to the east, if I was looking at a strategy, you might consider that threatening Crimea would be a very, very useful way to force Russia to rethink its strategy. Because, yes, Russia will grind away at the Donbass and potentially gradually take more and more ground. But if it thought it was going to lose Crimea, that would be a strategic failure for Russia. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that Ukraine would be able to take Crimea. Most military analysts think that would be a very difficult thing to do. But the more you give Ukraine boats, the more you give them long-range missiles, the more that they're successful at keeping the Black Sea Fleet off the battlefield, then the more that option is viable for Ukraine. Now, I reiterate, I have no idea what their strategy would be.
Yeah.
It's simply, how do you do something that changes the game and starts to give Ukraine an advantage in what is looking like an increasingly difficult battlefield?
Well, that's interesting. So maybe a combination of using long-range missiles and also raiding crafts, dive boats might be how you would go about attacking Crimea.
So one of the things you'd do is you'd want to sever the Kerch road rail bridge to stop the resupplies coming in. I've had several questions that come to me through the media stuff of people saying, why did Ukraine target it and then stop? Well, one of the explanations for that would be that they wanted to prove they could do it. And once you've proved you can do it, don't keep doing it. Do it when you need to do it. And if you're going to do a coordinated attack against Crimea, you would surgically take out the Kerch Road rail bridge, knowing how long it's going to take to recover it. You'd also have a whole series of amphibious attacks. You would take out some of the radar systems and the headquarters on Crimea itself, which the Ukrainians have done. And you would get the Black Sea Fleet away from the area so they couldn't interfere with your potential landing craft and amphibious assault on the island. Now, again, we've no way of knowing, but these are the ingredients that you would probably need. And even if it didn't happen, just the very threat of it could be enough for Russia to rebrigade its military resources to make sure that didn't fall under threat. So it'll be interesting, but bluntly, what Ukraine has to do is got to find a different way of fighting the war, because otherwise the option of liberating Ukraine completely is looking like even more challenging as the days turn into weeks, turn into months.
And so often, in war, we can talk about, so-called glamorous weapons like ATACMS and HIMARS and Patriot defence systems, etc. But fundamentally it comes down to ammunition rounds as well. And it's interesting, the UK saying they're going to provide 4 million ammunition rounds now to Ukraine. I mean, that is desperately needed on the front line, isn't it?
It is, and that's why this combination, you can't. Quantity has a quality all of its own. So bullets and artillery rounds, it is vital. But I reiterate, it's trying to be smart about how you do this stuff. I always use an analogy that back in the Second World War, we had 1,000 Lancaster bombers doing bombing raids, and each of those Lancasters had 20 bombs on, 20,000 bombs at a time heading off towards Nazi Germany. Do you know what the average miss distance of those bombs was at the time of the Second World War?
No, go on.
4 miles. That's how close, if you were aiming for a target, on average, you got your bombs. So even when you had 20,000 bombs raining down on the target, you still couldn't guarantee to hit it. Today, with technology, one Typhoon jet with 3 bombs can hit 3 targets within a 4-meter accuracy. So all of a sudden, you don't need 20,000 bombs. You need one aircraft with 3 bombs, and you can now pretty much guarantee to hit 3 targets. So the point is, what West technology delivers is a huge multiplying effect. It can be, rather than artillery rounds just flying backwards and forwards across the battlefield, which is what Russia uses. Some chap sat there at his gun all day just firing rounds. If you now start to use battlefield radars, and you can now detect where that round is coming from, you can predict where it's launched from, you can accurately get a grid reference to that point, and now you can deliver a round accurately on that point. Suddenly now, rather than just firing 20,000 rounds a day, Mr. Russian soldier is going to be thinking, next time I fire a round, I'm going to be directly targeted. So that's where, yes, you have to fire bullets and artillery rounds, but smart weapons that's where the game changer is genuinely provided by the West. It's a result at the end of the Second World War. We watched millions of people die on the battlefields, and when there has to be a smarter way of fighting wars. And that's why our Western doctrine is much more around the use of smart weapons. The trouble is they're bloody expensive and there's not many of them. And you can't nip down to Sainsbury's just to top up the basket when you're low on supplies. That's why industrialization of our industrial base, generating the quantities that are required on a modern battlefield. And that's something we haven't yet done in this country.
And just finally, Sean, do you think that the West has fundamentally changed its attitude when it comes to escalation? Because you're right, one of the big fears with providing various pieces of kit throughout this conflict has been that you would be provoking Russia and effectively declaring full-on war between NATO and Russia. And you sense with, every few months you hear, for example, yes, we will provide tanks, or yes, now we're going to provide attacker missiles or whatever, that is starting to shift. And the fear of escalation is receding, and there is maybe more of an awareness that there will have to be some kind of confrontation with Russia. Is that your analysis, or do you still think there is a very live fear of escalation?
The trouble is, it's a great question, James, because there's part of me that says that at the start of this campaign, the West and Ukraine's fears were aligned. Ukraine wants to liberate its country, but the West have seen a couple of world wars start this way, and therefore containing it early and stopping Putin becoming a threat to the whole of Europe was in everybody's interests. The trouble is today, most military analysts would say that Russia's military capability has been shown to be wanting, that it has lost well over 2,000 main battle tanks. It's had a massive bloody nose against an adversary in Ukraine that, on paper at least, it should have been able to walk over. Is Russia therefore a threat to Europe anymore? Almost certainly no. And therefore there is a risk that suddenly it's, right, we don't need to be involved anymore. Sorry, Ukraine, go and negotiate, call a halt to the war. You've lost some territory, but that's it, and we'll help rebuild the rest of the country. And I think that's really the Trump play. The flip side, which I think is that the danger of Putin succeeding in Ukraine is that will embolden him. And the worry is then, where does that lead you? Where does that leave China's aspirations to Taiwan? And the very fact that Putin keeps threatening political nuclear rhetoric, it's Putin's Russia that invaded Ukraine. He's the bad guy in this. He's the guy who's caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. He's the guy who's caused millions of people to relocate. And yet he's the one who's using threatening rhetoric to tell other people not to get involved, when actually and so far that threatening rhetoric has limited the Western political appetite to directly get involved. But if you stand back from this, he's a school bully. He's threatening to beat somebody up, and we all just cower away. And we throw a few weapons at it and sort of in a bit of an appeasement. I do think there'll be books written about this episode in our European and world history in the future. And my worry is that we'll look back and go, if we had stepped in, even though, Putin threatens a much broader war, Putin's Russia would have no chance at all if NATO was to put a no-fly zone in to protect Ukraine, not take on Russia in a war, but simply protect Ukraine and say, you can't get away with this. A powerful message to anywhere in the world. Russia wouldn't have an answer to it. And even Russia's doctrine doesn't talk about nuclear weapons in such a regard. It's one thing to threaten it, and it has scared people in the West. But bluntly, if you follow that through, you're giving license to bullies around the world to do whatever they want to do. In my book, that just can't be right.
Sean, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, James.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.